Hey everyone, in today's video I'm going to talk about isolationism in the 1920s and the 1930s. So after the United States involved themselves in World War I, Americans were ready to return to normalcy. And the culture of the 1920s, which came after the war, really shows exactly that. There was more leisure time, there was more focus on entertainment, and Americans decided that they did not want to be involved in any more wars, especially a war like that one, like World War One. There was also a strong anti European sentiments that came after the war. If you remember, we talked about how this led to immigration quotas being passed in the 1920s in class. Well, it also led to America wanting to remain isolationist. They felt that they had gone overseas to make the world safe for democracy, as President Wilson said. But they felt like the Europeans didn't listen, and now there were several dictatorships taking over countries there, and they didn't like that. For example, in Italy, the fascist Mussolini was taking over, in Russia, the communist Stalin, and in Germany, Hitler is becoming in charge. This made Americans feel like their efforts in World War I were for nothing, really. Plus, the book All Quiet on the Western Front becomes really popular in the United States. It was written by a German soldier who talked about how war was horrible for soldiers, especially those on the front lines, and how they didn't even feel normal again when they returned back home. Also, Americans felt like these ideas of collective security under the League of Nations weren't really working. These new totalitarian regimes were taking over new land, and the League of Nations, which was supposed to keep peace in the world, did nothing about it. Japan was allowed to invade Manchuria in 1931, Italy invades Ethiopia in 1935, and then Germany invades the Rhineland in 1936. And the European powers just practiced the policy of appeasement by giving this territory to Hitler and Germany. And then when the Great Depression hits, it makes sense that the United States wouldn't want to get into wars or be involved in any European affairs because they have their own domestic issues that they need to deal with. The economy was sinking, people were losing their jobs. They wanted to fix these problems before they went into war again to help people with their own problems back in Europe. By the time it looks like things might escalate in Europe to another huge war, people in the United States were still pushing for isolationism. The most famous was Gerald Nye. He was a senator who began to investigate the causes of World War I. His committee decided that American businesses gained a lot of money from the war and told people that Wilson only entered the war because he wanted to help the businesses out. Of course, many people saw this as wrong, especially because so many men died in World War I. His investigation leads to the government passing new neutrality acts. These created certain restrictions that would exist during times when other nations were at war. For example, no American would be allowed to sail on a belligerent ship or a ship from a nation that is at war, and no American would be allowed to sell weapons or make loans to a belligerent nation either. But as things got worse and countries like Italy and Japan became more aggressive, Roosevelt didn't want straight neutrality like these acts required. Instead, he gave his quarantine speech in 1937, where he said America needs to quarantine these aggressive nations by placing an economic embargo on them. He wasn't saying let's go fight them, but he was also recommending that the United States do something about it by hurting them financially. But the American people responded to his speech very negatively. They felt any involvement would lead to war and more Americans dying. Some went even as far as creating specific organizations to speak out against this involvement, like the America First Committee, which thought that the United States should only protect their own shores. Even if England fell completely, then they would just focus on stopping Hitler from entering the United States. The most famous spokesperson for the America First Committee was Charles Lindbergh, who, ironically, became famous for being the first person to fly by himself across the Atlantic Ocean. He traveled the country and gave speeches in support of isolationism. So you can see there are tons of examples of why the United States wanted to remain isolated in the 20s and the 30s. If you have a question on World War II, this would make really good context for that question. You could also maybe be asked a short answer question about this time period or some multiple choice questions from this time period. But we know the United States does eventually enter into the conflict, and so the practice question today actually focuses a little bit more on that idea of Roosevelt trying to convince the American people that they need to move away from isolationism and enter the conflict for World War II. In this case, we have an excerpt from Roosevelt's For Freedom speech, and he says, "In the future days which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms."
The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy, peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world.
I have 3 practice questions here about President Roosevelt's For Freedom speech that he gives in his State of the Union address in 1941. Go ahead and take a second to pause the video, look at the questions, and then check out the answers in the description of the video below. Number 1, Roosevelt's speech was most likely intended to increase public support for. Number 2, which of the following most immediately increased enthusiasm in the United States for upholding the freedoms outlined in the excerpt? And number 3, which of the following most directly contributed to Roosevelt's view that freedom from want was necessary? Hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thanks for watching.